Good evening. Thank you so much for hosting both Mr. Mahjoub and I. My name is Syed Hassan. I'm an organizer with the Justice for Mahjoub Network. I want to begin by acknowledging the Treaty 6 territory that we're on. As migrants, many of us understand that all too well the relationship between colonization and immigration. As people from places recently colonized, who arrived either coerced or willingly, people who are part of the we can too easily become part of the colonial project. So we have an obligation to link migrant justice struggles with those of indigenous sovereignty. Responsible, consistent allyship is the ground on which at least we believe we need to walk together. We're here to speak of terrorism. Let that be perfectly clear. The terrorization of people of color, of Muslim communities, here on Turtle Island and in other places we've called home. And the Canadian government is a long-time practitioner of these acts of war, torture, repression, which began with the dispossession, murder, and attempted destruction of indigenous peoples and communities. So today, as we're going to speak about Mr. Mahjoub's experiences and of other migrants, let's remember where these practices began. They began against indigenous people. They were perfected against women, against queer communities, against disabled and trans people in this place, on this continent. I also want to say that I'm honored to be here with Mr. Mahjoub, a man whose courage, resilience, and integrity humbles me and inspires many. For over 12 years, Mr. Mahjoub has been used as a scapegoat in the so-called war of terror. And systems have been designed to isolate him, silence him, and demonize him. The Canadian government has tried to destroy his humanity and crush his dignity. And the fact that he sits here with us today, having survived those 12 years, not only survived, but willing and able to speak out publicly, is a victory for human dignity. And it's a testament to the resilience of our collective communities. So again, thank you. Mr. Mahjoub will tell you his story, and I'm going to take a few minutes to just contextualize the systems and policies that bring us here. Mr. Mahjoub was arrested, as you all know, and is being held under what is called a security certificate. The first thing you need to know about a security certificate is that it is not part of criminal law, it's part of immigration law. Many of the assumptions that we bring with us around how the criminal law and the justice systems work, many of them just simply do not apply. Security certificates cannot be used against citizens, okay? They can only be used against migrants, and as migrants being primarily people of color, this is entirely a racist legislation. That is what it is, and that is what it is meant to be, okay? So immigration by law, by definition, is a two-tiered system. And what do I mean by that? It's a system that must include some and excludes many, okay? So the notion of fairness in such a system just simply does not apply. Now, in Canada, we see 70% of refugees being denied. We see that there are no avenues for permanent status for for poor and low-income workers around the world. We see that many of us come here, we work here, we exploited here and cannot stay. Often broken in some ways, we return, sometimes hurt, sometimes ready to die. As a dear friend of mine tells me, this country treats many migrants like chewing gum. They chew us, they take out our juice, and they spit us out when they're done. Since Harper has come up to power, nearly 80,000 migrants have been detained and deported. So 80,000 detention, 80,000 deportations. And those are the people that are actually physically forced onto a plane. Others that are so-called voluntarily removed, based on coercion. That number is far, far greater. And it is within this context of detention, deportation, denial of status that we must understand Mr. Mahjoub's story and the security certificate regime. The immigration system functions on fear, okay? As many children of newcomers will tell you, our parents told us to keep quiet, keep our heads down, just get through with it. The government tells us that though we have status, we somehow still have to earn it. Temporary migrant workers are told to shut up, work, or be deported. And that's called euphemistically repatriation. Undocumented families live daily facing fear and intimidation. The very act of registering your child in a school is both fearful and a site of resistance. And we see that routinely deportation is being turned into a spectacle. Most recently in Vancouver, we saw a reality TV show where deportation was turned into entertainment, and it keeps happening. It's this fear, packaged and sold, created by the Conservative government and the Liberals prior to it and the ones prior to that. And it's not just being used against migrants. It's being used against everybody, even those who carry that blue book that allows you to, cross ports. It's this fear-mongering that we must understand the security certificate regime under. security certificates are the sharp end of that cycle and system of fear. And so by being here, part of our project is to shatter that fear, is to insist that we will refuse to be scared, that we will hear these stories and we will stand stronger as communities. Security certificates are a specific legal measure that allows the government to indefinitely detain people without charge and to deport them based on profile. They are not accused of any crime, but are accused of matching the profile of someone who could pose a danger. Let me repeat myself. Mr. Mahjoub has not been accused of any crime, ever. He has never been charged. He has spent 12 years in detention. This is straight up profiling, okay? It might be wrapped up in a lot of legal jargon. There's a lot of war profiteering experts who are involved. And it may seem slightly more sophisticated than the crude profiling that, say, the Edmonton police does in the poorest parts of this city. It costs more, but at its core, it's the same thing. It's an assessment of whether someone is a potential danger based on how they think, what they look like, who they associate with, where they live, where they have lived, and how other authorities regard them. The key difference is that the Edmonton police will insist that it does not profile, that it's actually fair, in that they don't do racial profiling, for example, despite all the evidence I'm sure to the contrary. In the security certificate system, profiling is legally sanctioned and is part of the entire system. The federal court in Mr. Mahjoub's case has stated explicitly that the presumption of innocence does not apply. Okay? We're not talking about charges or trials, evidence, guilt or innocence or fairness. Right? Those things have all been thrown out long ago. And I would suggest can easily be thrown out for anyone. Now, because there's no charges, there's no question of guilt or innocence, it's basically an assessment of potential danger, future danger. And that profile, at least in these cases, is always a profile of a Muslim man. Let me try and break down the process very quickly. So first, CSIS, that's Canada's wannabe CIA, is a secret report to the minister, okay? Minister of Immigration and the Minister of Public Safety. The person who wrote Mr. Mahjoub's report in 2008, this is 2008, after in 2007 the Supreme Court, after a huge amount of public organizing, had deemed the security certificate system unconstitutional. The government had brought it back in 2008. And they hired this guy to write a report to suggest why a new security certificate was being issued against Mr. Mahjoub. He testified that he had never heard of the security certificate system until the day he was contracted by the federal government to write the report that would put Mr. Mahjoub back into prison. The ministers then signed, based on this information, a certificate that says that the claims that the person is a potential threat and therefore inadmissible to Canada. Okay? Recently, back in October, we forced Stockwell Day, who was then Minister of Public Safety, into court, and he said he could, and he said he could not recall how many documents and which documents he read. He just thought he'd read something. Yeah. This is before he signed this. Okay? Once that thing is, sorry?
Can he read?
I'm sure he can read. There are other problems. So once the certificate is signed, the person can be arrested and detained. Okay, pending the outcome of the case. In Mr. Mahjoub's case, we're entering year 13. And if the court agrees that the person can be released from prison into either house arrest or waiting liberation and deportation. The detainee at this point is generally referred in the mainstream media as a terrorist suspect. Right? Now that's a kind of a meaningless phrase. What is a terrorist suspect? It's like a suspected, because he's not being charged. It's not that he's being told that he did an action. It's a possible act that he will do. Right? And this meaningless term is just used and thrown about. And that's what we are, part of the context we're living in. And that's about creating fear. Because when you know that there is a possible threat emerging somewhere out there, then people will be very willing to sacrifice their rights. Now, then the person is allowed to go to the federal court and quote-unquote defend himself or themselves. This federal process has been endlessly criticized. As I said, it's been deemed unconstitutional in 2007. Here are some key problems with it. First, the court relies on secret information. Okay? So remember, there's no trial. So there's no such thing as evidence in these cases. What it is it's information. The detainee and their lawyers do not have access to most of this secret information. Okay? There are secret hearings in which these things are talked about, decided. Sometimes Mr. Mahjoub may receive a summary of the decision, sometimes he may not. Okay? I think we can take questions at the end. Cool. Secondly, there's this anything goes approach to information. Hearsay, triple hearsay, unsourced reports from foreign spy agencies, newspaper clippings, right-wing Islamophobic websites, ramblings of a disgruntled neighbor, fear-induced exaggeration of a refugee in an interview with CSIS. Everything is accepted, everything is considered intelligent. So from the fact that your neighbor doesn't like you to the fact that a journalist is incompetent, those things, once they're written down, can be used against you. Third, it relies on an extremely low standard of proof. I'm sure many of us have watched crime movies. We've heard the phrase, beyond reasonable doubt, yes? Okay, that's a legal test that evidence needs to meet. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt this person is what you say he is. In the security certificate system, it's called reasonable grounds to believe. They're vague, general allegations. As long as you can prove, the government can prove that it has reasonable grounds to believe it's vague allegations, the certificate will be held as reasonable. So these federal court proceedings are called reasonability hearings, which Mr. Mahjoub has just completed. So taken together, it simply means that it's almost impossible to win your case. Okay, as one Montreal Muslim leader put it, security certificates rely on extremely low standards that have extremely serious consequences. The exact opposite of what we imagine justice to be. Okay? If the certificate is upheld, the person becomes deportable. Now, if this extremely broken, unfair, completely in shambles system was not enough, repeatedly CSIS and CBSA. CBS is the Canada Border Services Agency. I call them immigration thugs. You can call them whatever you want. CSIS and other government agencies have been caught in repeated scandals, including they've lied to the courts. They've repressed evidence that the people whose information they were providing to the court actually had failed lie detector tests. They were found to have been sharing information illegally with foreign intelligence agencies. They destroyed information in the case that did not support their case. They violated Mr. Mahjoub's solicitor-client privilege, including seizing his confidential court preparation documents. They systematically used evidence obtained from torture. They introduced information which, despite their own assessment, said it would violate laws. They would still bring it into court. And they completely made up Mr. Mahjoub's legal history in Egypt. Mr. Mahjoub is going to speak about a lot of these in detail. I'm just going to elaborate on one, and that's the one about information obtained under torture. Now, many of the allegations that are thrown around against Mr. Mahjoub have actually never appeared in his public case. So Mr. Mahjoub is often ending up defending himself against reports that CSIS and CBSA have leaked to their hacks in the Globe and Mail and Canadian press, etc. Primary among these is the alleged allegation that Mr. Mahjoub the alleged participation of Mr. Mahjoub in what's called the Vanguards of Conquest, the VOC, and so-called convictions in Egypt under the Mubarak regime. As Mr. Mahjoub will tell you in detail, these are made-up assertions, and in fact the VOC simply does not exist. Now, much of this CSIS claims comes out of interviews that it did with Mr. Mahjoub in 1995. Except those interviews were summarized, and then the interview was destroyed. And that summary was summarized, and that summary was destroyed. And then that summary was summarized, and the previous one was destroyed 5 times over. Okay? Now, in 2008, the Canadian government was about to pass what's called Bill C-3. At that time, the head of CSIS, Jim Judd, wrote a secret letter to the Minister of Public Safety saying, if this bill passed, it would render unsustainable the current security certificate proceedings. Because this bill was banning intelligence agencies to use information obtained by torture or from agencies that were getting tortured. Okay. Not only that, the letter said that the bulk of information utilized against Mr. Mahjoub in Mr. Mahjoub's certificate was supplied by agencies directly associated with torture. Bill C-3 passed. This letter was then hidden away until 2011, when it was finally reported in the media. Okay? So the government knew that it had now passed a law that made the security certificate proceedings unviable and indefensible. And today we sit here 6 years from that date, 3 years after it's come out, and these proceedings continue. Curiously, the courts have done absolutely nothing. They usually say some few harsh words, so, Mr. Mahjoub's case, when CSIS accepted that despite being ordered to stop, they continue to illegally tap Mr. Mahjoub's phone calls. All they do is say a few harsh words about how the justice system should be better than that, and the case continues. In any other proceeding, the case would have been thrown out 5 times over. Now, in addition to Mr. Mahjoub, there are 2 other men who are currently on a security certificate. Mohammad Mahjoub, who was arrested in December 2002. He's still awaiting a return to Supreme Court. The second one is Mahmoud Jabala. Just to give you a sense of how this works, he was first arrested. Jabala was first arrested in 1999. He won his first case, so he said it was unreasonable, the case was thrown out. He was re-arrested in August of 2001. Same information. That second certificate was thrown out on technical grounds. A third one was issued. The Supreme Court threw that out. A fourth one was issued. Always on the same information. He's currently on his 5th security certificate. Okay? And this was issued in 2008, and it still hasn't reached the federal court. I think it has actually just recently reached the federal court. He's living under house arrest in Toronto. The 2 other men that were held on this are Adil Sharkawi, Hassan and Amri. Both saw their certificates thrown out in 2009. The government is yet to give them status, or actually apologize to them, give them status, give them the money they're suing you for. Now, I want us to know this, okay? As of 2009, no new security certificates have been issued. They've not been issued because of the enormous amount of community organizing and public pressure that has taken place across Canada, okay? And that's really, really important. We're here to ensure that Mr. Mahjoub is free and all the men's lives are restored, and that people who did these abuses are held accountable. But no new security certificates currently are being issued. But that does not mean that harassment by immigration is ended. So what the government has done is using something called Section 86 national security grounds, which is being invoked for people. People are then declared inadmissible. They're not held for long periods, but they are deported. Sogi Singh, Ivan Sanchez, and 2 people who this happened to. I know these names are not as well known. We need to know them. Amparo Torres, she was actually being deported under these, and she fought and won her case just 6 months ago. The second thing that CSIS and RCMP is using is what's called gray zone powers. And what they've created is they've created a project called disruption. Okay? How disruption works is they issue threats against people. They say that we will revoke your status in the country. They simply blacklist people, so you show up at an airport and you can't fly, you don't know what's happening. Or they continue to harass people over and over, doing multiple CSIS visits, making up allegations, essentially driving people out of the country. 2 days ago, we were in Calgary, and we heard multiple people tell us these stories of this happening in Calgary. We know it's happening in Toronto and Montreal. The worst thing is people are not reporting it, because the idea that CSIS is visiting people is completely shut out of Muslim communities, and it's happening at an extremely large rate. We simply don't know how much. The other thing that the immigration has begun to do is it's tried to basically share a lot more information with overseas partners. So, for example, they outsourced the detention and deportation of Abdul Razak, the Abu Sufyan Abdul Razak. They put him on a UN security list when he landed in Sudan. He was held there for 6 years, tortured. Now, obviously, criminal law standards are much better than immigration law, but they've been consistently being lowered, and they're using anti-terrorism. They're using anti-terrorism laws, again, almost entirely against Muslim communities. So these include Project Samosa and the Toronto 18. I don't know if you've heard of them. The Toronto 18 is probably a little better well known. Project Samosa has currently 3 men in detention in Ontario and Kingston in Ottawa. So the government has, and then there's extradition laws, right? So people like Hassan Diab, who's a professor in Ottawa who's facing extradition. So the extradition laws have been weakened. And Gary Freeman was extradited to the United States. So while we managed to get this one law passed, they're actually appearing in multiple regulations. And as I listed, a lot of the people are not all Muslims, but it is happening to almost everyone I listed, the people of color, immigrants, and these vague threats of terrorism, etc. That allows this entire industry to continue. So we're going to hear Mr. Mahjoub's story. We need to really understand it. We need to really support him. And we need to understand that this injustice cannot end until we can actually begin to move towards an immigration system that does not continue to exclude people.